Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and today we are going to do the next obvious commentary. I don't know if you're sick of the monsters or not, but we are going to do Frankenstein today. And I had some debates over maybe this wasn't the best one to do, but you have to do Frankenstein after Dracula. It's such a logical choice. The edition we are watching today is the Laserdisc edition again, believe it or not, because it's in my computer room. I'm going to begin the film on the famous opening where Edward von Sloan steps in to give his audience a word of friendly warning. And we're going to do that in about 3 seconds. 1, 2, and 3. How do you do? Mr. Carl Lemley feels it would be unkind to present this film without, just a word of friendly warning. I don't think Universal quite knew what they had on their hands after Dracula, because that was a huge, huge success. And the next obvious choice, I suppose, would be Frankenstein. Frankenstein had an interesting production, and I know a lot of people really like to follow it up. It was initially going to be a Bela Lugosi vehicle, as a lot of people know, and there are a lot of legends about why Lugosi didn't take the role. Was he fired? Was it the makeup test that was terrible? Or did he feel the part was unsexy for a big star like him? It was originally going to be directed by Robert Florey, who was a French director who was influenced by the Expressionist films from Germany. Eventually, Lugosi and Florey would go on to do Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is a fantastic movie, which I'd really highly recommend seeing if you're at all interested in, finding an underrated horror film that flew under the radar. But what happened was Frankenstein became something altogether different. Instead of Florey and Lugosi, James Whale was brought in. And James Whale was a pretty unique individual. I love all of his films, especially his horror films. They have a lot of biting humor to it. And, finding out a little bit about James Whale himself, he was a unique character, that's for sure. And I think what is interesting about his horror films is that there's definitely a cutting, blasphemous edge to them. Here we have our old friend Dwight Fry again, and Colin Clive. Colin Clive, I really, really love. I think he's just as good as Karloff, Lugosi, any horror legend. And this performance is something to behold. I don't think I've ever seen an actor quite successfully as Clive kind of skate between the realms of going way over the top, but yet having that grave sincerity about him. This is one of my favorite moments in the film. And, like I was saying in the Dracula commentary, feel that thud on the newly made grave on the casket. And I think audiences in 1931, Dracula was child's play and compared to what we're about to witness here. The idea of playing God, Dracula being a parody of Christ's resurrection, is not quite so much as it's done here. This takes that to a whole nother level. And you have Colin Clive with all his fierceness there to remind you every step of the way.
Now, come on.
Fritz and Henry are about to dig up the new-made grave. And this is kind of blatantly sums up what Whale is doing here. Clive lifts his shovel and throws his dirt in the face of death itself. It's a great moment. I kind of wish, Whale would have gone one step further and threw it at that crucifix right to the other side. But, this film had trouble enough with those accusations of blasphemy. Jeez. Clive here is one of Whale's favorite actors that he worked with. He worked with him in the theater in a film before this called The Journey's End, which was kind of Whale's, career-making picture. And Whale, I guess initially, he was offered a few films, and he chose Frankenstein because he thought it proposed some interesting opportunities. And, the imagery of this film, it still is really haunting. It hasn't lost a step after all these years. The hanging corpse swinging around. Just like being in 1931, you thought Dracula was a lot. And just in the first 5 minutes of this film alone, digging up a corpse, and now this. Frankenstein began its life, at least in this incantation of the story, as a stage play as well by Hamilton Dean and I believe John Balderston as well, who wrote the Dracula edition. It was written in the UK by Peggy Webling and done by Dean at the time, who played the monster in the play. And that, I think, is what drew Universal to this project as a follow-up to Dracula, that they could do it in a similar way. But I think Whale really transcends everything. Frankenstein feels like it has a much more epic scope than Dracula did. Dracula feels confined in rooms, and Frankenstein just... You can tell that there was some success with Dracula, and that this film is much bigger with budget and what it's able to play with. Here we have Edward von Sloan again, who we saw at the famous opening, warning us to step out if the movie would rattle our nerves. And he's essentially playing a similar role to what he did in Dracula, but I think he's much better in Frankenstein than he was in that film. Dr. Waldman serves kind of as the moral conscience of the story. The figure who reminds Henry that he's playing God and that there are some boundaries that are too great to pass. And I think Sloane's performance here is actually helped a great deal by his castmates, Colin Clive. With Dracula, Sloane, I don't know, the film is very slow and methodical, and he interacts with people like Herbert Bunston who just don't bring a lot of passion to it. And I think Colin Clive, with his frenzy and the belief he puts into Henry about what he's doing, really gives Sloane a lot of power. And he's really good in this film, I think. Not so much in Dracula. Right now we have Dwight Frye, probably in his most famous scene. He's looking for a brain to put into the creature, and he grabs that normal brain, which of course crashes when he sees his shadow. And he brings in the abnormal brain, which It's a classic scene, and it's been, I don't know if it's been done a lot before, but the idea of the tainted brain was done a different way in Curse of Frankenstein. But, of course, this scene was famously parodied in Young Frankenstein, Abby Normal. I don't actually like the scene all that much. You know, when we get past the classic iconic nature of it, I think it kind of diminishes the character of the monster, and that, you know, you kind of expect him to be evil or insane. And I just think it's a real kind of a lazy plot device. You know, it kind of really hurts the monster, I think, because why does he need an explanation? Isn't the fact that he's thrusted back into life in that hulking body enough to draw sympathy to him, enough for Karloff to begin his characterization? Here we have John Bowles as Victor Moritz, Henry's friend, and Mae Clark as Elizabeth, Henry's fiance. And I think she has a lot to bring to this picture. She, above anyone else, I think, maybe not so much. I mean, I think maybe Zita Johann and The Mummy might be a little better, but I think she is the best leading woman we've had in a Universal monster film. She really has a lot of fire to her, you know? She isn't just this damsel in distress. She really shows a lot of passion and love for Henry, and she wants to save him. And I really like her in the film a lot. John Bowles as Victor Moritz, not really all that interesting a character. He doesn't really do anything. He's kind of got that sly smile saying, "Oh, I wish you were fond of me." He really wants Elizabeth, and Colin Clive isn't really oblivious to it. He just kind of shrugs it off. Right now, it would be a good time to go into kind of more about James Whale. I'm sure many of you know that he was an openly gay man in this Hollywood society, and that's probably the only place where someone like him would be accepted at this time. He was a stage director. He fought in the First World War, and he actually, in a prisoner of war camp, developed his own theater company, which I always thought was a really cool story. He brought Journey's End again to Broadway and eventually directed the film adaptation, which starred Colin Clive and David Manners. And like Karloff and Lugosi, he too kind of found himself typecast in horror films. And I don't know if he was pleased about it, but he definitely brings a certain humor to his films. And I think it's interesting comparing Frankenstein to his later efforts like The Old Dark House, The Invisible Man, and eventually Bride of Frankenstein. Some people feel that Frankenstein is actually inferior to Invisible Man and Bride of Frankenstein because it doesn't really have that humor. It's got more of a seriousness to it. There is some elements of satire, but they're much graver and much more, I would say, bolder and angrier in the idea that what Henry is doing is playing God. And it's a little bit more cheerfully blasphemous in the Bride of Frankenstein in particular. You see Karloff being strung up on a makeshift crucifix, or in the Old Dark House, which is one that isn't seen quite as often, but the family is very Christian, and despite all their weirdness and quirks. Here we have the famous laboratory, and we're about to see Henry bring the creature to life. The same equipment would be used again in Young Frankenstein, and I think it was used again in Bride of Frankenstein, but there's some variations here. It was designed by an electrician named Strickfaden, I believe was his name, and it's really incredible pieces of technology. What I really, really like about Colin Clive here is that he kind of skates on the edge of being crazy and being a dreamer. I like stories like that, and I think Colin Clive really brings out the kind of youthful passion as well. You know, just the idea that if I can do this, I should, and I will be able to prove myself. He's really good when he's accused of being crazy. I really love that moment. He has a great monologue later in the film where it kind of sums up this story from Frankenstein's point of view, that if man didn't enact on their dreams, they would be nothing. They wouldn't be able to evolve. And just this idea that maybe evolution of human thinking can solve this great crisis, or not crisis, but solve the great mystery of what God has. And this really is the greatest power that God supposedly has over human beings, the idea of creating life. We're kind of getting some teases at Karloff right here. You're seeing the top of his flattened head as well as his scarred hands. And what you don't really hear, there's a lot of legends that go on about Karloff and how he eventually came to the role of Frankenstein. He wasn't a total unknown at this time. A lot of stories say that this was, well, not really stories, but a lot of people preconceive that this was Karloff's first movie, that he didn't do anything before this. But that's really complete nonsense. He had a somewhat successful silent career as kind of a bit player. He had actually had a pretty well-praised performance before this, which probably, contrary to that classic story about Whale meeting Karloff in his best suit in the Universal Lounge and saying, you know, your face presents some interesting possibilities. That probably wasn't true, although I would like it to believe. He actually was in a Howard Hawks film called The Criminal Code. It's not really all that memorable a film. Karloff is really good in it, though. He plays this hardened criminal who is kind of the master of this prison system. And it's all about the honor code of a prison and the idea of these prisoners being brothers with one another. And Karloff plays the villain in it. And he's really, really good. You definitely can see the seeds of his horror films in there. Karloff actually met Lon Chaney. That's another popular rumor about him. He met Lon Chaney, when he was a struggling actor, and Chaney offered him this advice: find something that only you can do, and do it better than anyone else. Crazy, am I? See if I'm crazy or not. And that is Colin Clive at his best. Clive would go on to appear in The Bride of Frankenstein, and by then he's pretty much completely diminished. It's really sad seeing his performance in The Bride of Frankenstein. He was a very troubled man and lived a hard life. He, I guess, had a lot of health problems and was very depressed, and he tried to self-medicate with alcohol, unfortunately. He came from a very prestigious British noble family, and he came to the U.S. to do Frankenstein. He hurt his leg on horseback, and it's noticeable in Bride of Frankenstein. He doesn't appear on his feet very much. He's usually sitting in a chair or laying in bed, suffering from his injuries of the previous film. And this film in particular, Frankenstein, I think really shows what he could do. I don't think I've seen him in any film but his horror films. Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, and a great Peter Lorre film called Mad Love. But really, just based on this film alone, it's a brilliant performance. Here's the pseudoscience behind everything. Frankenstein telling Dr. Waldman about the colors of the spectrum and the rays, what he does, how he intends to bring the creature to life. Like I said before in the Frankenstein meets the Wolfman commentary, I just love hearing how they intend to do everything. But I think this film in particular really does it the best. The great ray that creates life. It's kind of a line of dialogue that it's kind of thrown away, but I think just the idea of it is really cool. You know, it's kind of how it brings a lot of ideas of how God created man. And here's Frankenstein bragging about the idea of creating the body with his own hands, not thinking past to the fact of whether the body that comes to life will thank him for life, for what he will do with that body once it's alive. Frankenstein was actually the only, I think, horror film that made the AFI's first top 100 horror film, top 100 horror films, top 100 films of all time in 1997, and when the list was reassessed in 2007, it was taken off, and that just really, really depressed me. In place was The Sixth Sense, believe it or not. You know, even by then they should have known that Shyamalan was kind of a one-trick pony. Just seeing the monster being brought back to life on all that machinery is incredible. And Clive has so much to this role. He adds so much to it. I mean, it's really hard. You know, like you look at some of these horror films, and before the monsters come, you need someone to really go into the exposition of how these monsters work, how the science of this world works, how the mythology. And, you know, in Dracula, it was Van Sloan, who was frankly kind of boring, very slow. But you have Clive here, who is so passionate about everything he says, who has clear motivations, even if they aren't sound, and it's just incredible. Right now, we're about to witness probably the most famous scene in horror history, the monster coming to life. And it has a line here that was taken out of the film for a very long time. I don't know if it was in the film at the very first release, but it had to be taken out in 1934 for a reissue. Henry says, "In the name of God, I know what it feels like to be God." And I'm actually, on this Laserdisc edition, this isn't the one that includes that line. Lightning bolt comes over it. And Frankenstein, you know, just that idea of censoring the movie. I think Frankenstein is really the first instance of, you know, the birth of the rating system. And, you know, the idea that, you know, they got these groups, religious groups in particular, parents groups who feel that they have the right to censor movies. And you really have Whale, who pushes the boundaries. You know, maybe he pushed them a little too far, but I gotta say I love him for it, because this movie really does take a lot of risk, and like just the idea of, you know, being so open against kind of what people held so dear, the idea of God, and challenging them. This film really challenged the audiences, and, you know, sometimes they don't like to be challenged, unfortunately. We're being introduced to Henry's father, Frederick Kerr, and, you know, he's pretty good in the movie, kind of like the character of Martin in Dracula, Baron Frankenstein. He's just this curmudgeonly old man, and, you know, the idea of you know, the idea is you need some laughs in a movie like this. You need to have a break from all the horrors. And the horrors in Frankenstein were greater than anything you'd seen before. And Whale, I think Whale understands that pretty well. You know, right after a very bad scare, you kind of need a laugh to get you out of it, to understand that the world isn't so grim. I think this is probably the best. He's pretty good. I think it's the best comic relief we've had in a movie like this in the old Universal monster films. Here's Lionel Belmore, who, like Dwight Fry, he's in a lot of these Frankenstein movies. This is his biggest role as the Burgomaster. But he actually appears in a few horror films after this, Frankenstein movies. He's in Son of Frankenstein as one of the councilmen who is the target of Igor's revenge. And Igor has the monster strangle him to death. And, you know, believe it or not, if you watch the movie Ghost of Frankenstein, he's back from the dead and serving on the same council. Here's that monologue from Clive that I really love, and I think it really sums up his character. Dangerous. Have you never wanted to do anything that was dangerous? I really like this monologue because I think it sort of humanizes Frankenstein's character. And like the whole idea of it is kind of a tough sell back then, that this guy did a really kind of questionable, horrible thing, and and you don't see him as a villain, Dr. Frankenstein. Henry isn't a bad guy here. He's just a dreamer who set the bar a little too high, went into fields that, although, you kind of admire him for setting out, he maybe didn't look a little far. And Waldman's right, his success was intoxicating. The idea of doing it was intoxicating, that he didn't look towards the people that he loved and how it would affect them, or how it would affect the monster who we're about to meet right now. And here's Waldman going into the idea of the criminal brain, and all Henry has to say is, oh, was it only a piece of dead tissue? You'd have to think Henry, or just any doctor, Henry's was in Waldman's class, you'd have to think that, hey, maybe he would know what a criminal brain would look like. Right now we're about to meet the monster, and Frankenstein really set the bar high for just creating a character. The monster is the perfect combination of the director and the art and the actor and the makeup artist, Jack Pierce, working together to create a fully dimensional character. And Whale's introduction of the monster is fantastic. You see him walking backwards, you want to see his face, and then slowly looks at you. And Whale is just brutal. He goes in twice for close-ups, and you see just the extent of what the monster looks like. And that, that makeup, the look of the monster is so iconic that you sort of lose sight of kind of what it must have looked like the first time for people to see it. You look at makeup on the characters or on the actor, and I think a big part of why Karloff was so successful as the monster is that he had a great face for it. You notice with Chaney Jr. in particular in Ghost of Frankenstein that, just putting a flat head on someone doesn't make them a monster. Karloff's eyes are sunken. He had a bridge work that he would take out so the cheeks were flattened, and those wax over the eyes. Apparently when Pierce was putting the finishing touches on it, Karloff said, couldn't we do something extra to make him look dead? And the flat top on the head, you're like, why is that there? But I love the explanation from Jack Pierce that Frankenstein isn't, he's a young man, he's not that great experienced surgeon, and so like the head is actually a rudimentary way so they could quickly get the brain inside the skull. And Karloff is beautiful here. I love the way that he uses his hands, like holding them out like that, saying, you're wondering what he asks. And when he looks to the sun, it's a beautiful moment. You just wonder what he's thinking. And just going off of what was said earlier, the idea of the abnormal brain. I've heard some theories about why Frankenstein is afraid of fire, or the monster. I don't want to open up that can of worms, but why the monster is afraid of fire and why he looks so longingly at the sun there. The idea was that he was actually a soul damned to hell, and just the idea of being thrust back into life in that old body kind of shocked him, and that looking at the sun is looking at heaven, and that his fear of fire is his fear of hellfire. And I don't like the theory. I have one of my own, which I definitely would like to share with you. If I were to play the monster, and I don't know if Karloff is going through this, he probably isn't, but I like to view it as this, is that the brain was abnormal, but it was the brain of an autistic person or someone with developmental disabilities. And the idea is that he can't share what he wants to say on his mind because he has that hindrance, and the only way the monster can really interact with people is through his brute force. Dwight Fry is taken out of the picture, and, he's pretty good here, but it wasn't brave of him or wise of him to shove a fire in the face of a giant Hulk with such great strength like that. There's another pretty horrible image. Whale was probably pretty wise in kind of showing that, not highlighting that. Karloff became Universal's go-to guy, I guess you would say. I think what they really wanted in their horror star was someone that they could advertise as the next Man of 1,000 Faces, the next Lon Chaney. And initially, they thought it was Lugosi, and that really wasn't fair. It wasn't a good idea. They then found Karloff, who I think they didn't really quite understand all that well either. To be fair, Universal, the production department, Carl Laemmle Jr., they weren't actors, they weren't directors, they weren't artists, they were marketeers. And I've seen photos from this time and posters that said if Lon Chaney were here, he'd name Boris Karloff his successor. And just looking at this film, and then the film after it, the follow-up, The Old Dark House, I think Karloff could have easily have fallen into the trap of playing these silent brutes. He followed Frankenstein with another huge hit, The Mummy, which there's a moment that was taken out of the other editions, the idea of impaling the monster with the syringe. I have a middle edition of it. It's marketed as restored, but I don't think the film really got to where it wanted to be until about the mid-90s in the classic Monster collection, when they restored the lines and the scene where the monster throws little Maria into the pond. Dr. Veldman. Here we have old Frederick Kerr as the Baron to save the day. This is such a horrible scene. The monster coming to life and murdering poor Fritz, and now we need a good laugh from Frederick Kerr. And Victor Moritz again. It's no surprise that he wasn't in Bride of Frankenstein, because he really serves no purpose to this film. I kind of wish that the monster actually, I think it would have been a stronger film had he killed him off in the finale Had he been on the hunt with Frankenstein?
What sort of place for my son to be in?
I really like Colin Clive's physicality in his role. I think Frankenstein would have been interesting as a silent film. I don't know if the film was shown as a silent, because around the time they did market a silent version to go along with the sound versions, because the films, not all the theaters had sound equipment yet. But I just digressing, I really like Colin Clive's face and his eyes. And I think a great moment of that is when we see how weak and depleted Henry becomes here when his father sees him. And just the idea that, he's starting to realize that this whole project has finally taken such a toll on him. Waldman's about to leave the story here. I really like how cavalier the movie is about killing Waldman. It's a great scene. It's a little bit further from here, but we'll see. Karloff would go on to play the monster 3 times, and the last time was in Son of Frankenstein. And just kind of going off the idea of what he brought to the monster, I really think the monster's story, and this is the monster's story as much as it is Henry's, it's an arc that has a very concrete beginning, middle, and end. And it doesn't really end here. The whole idea, the monster realizing what he is. I really love the moment in Bride of Frankenstein when the monster realizes that he'd be better off dead. And, Karloff, I was sure, thought that was when the monster should have ended, because he realized what his life meant. And he left the role after Son of Frankenstein, which is a pretty decent movie. I really like Son of Frankenstein. I might argue that it's just as good as the first 2 in the series. But the monster's a prop in it. And you don't want the monster to be a prop. And that, unfortunately, did happen as the series progressed. Just the thought of this scene here, where Waldman realizes that the only way to destroy the monster is by dissection, must have been just as horrifying. Just the implications of it. Frankenstein does what a good horror film should do. It doesn't necessarily go into the grotesques of the scenario. It implies them. It doesn't show here, for instance, that Waldman, starting to cut up the monster and bringing him to put him to death. He just kind of shows the tools. And I think that's what a good horror film should do. It should leave the horror to the imagination sometimes. And Whale, I think, does a really good job of mixing that up. You don't know what is going to explicitly be shown. And so, you see the monster walk through the front door like that, and you don't know what's going to be shown. But then Whale, he doesn't leave anything to the imagination in that scene. He thrusts the camera right through. And then in later scenes, you don't see it. So the film kind of keeps you on edge that way. Kind of like, I would say, Jaws later on. I think that's definitely a film in this vein, in that there's implied horror, but then the implied horror builds up to the real horror that you get to see. I really like this scene, too, with Colin Clive. I think it shows the multi-dimensions of his character. You know, it could have been very easy just for Clive to be on the high voltage the whole time and just be stark raving mad, but he definitely does have a very very sweet tone to hear. You believe this relationship with Elizabeth, and I think it really strengthens Mae Clark's character as well, in that you see that Henry is a good man, and that there is something that she is attracted to, and I think that's very good. Here's the famous wedding scene here in the film, and this is probably the one of the other memorable scenes in the film, when Frankenstein's monster confronts Elizabeth, and it's just going off of what I was just saying, the implication there is that there's going to be rape. And the audiences, I don't know if at the time, but I think definitely as the film grew older and, it got new fans, I think the audiences gravitated to what Karloff was intending. That the monster was this childlike figure who didn't really intend to do harm. He was just placed in this massive body. And so, in a scene like the one I was mentioning about Elizabeth, maybe the audiences in 1931 thought that the monster was malicious and horrible. But, there was more to it than meets the eye. And going off of the idea that Karloff was the second Lon Chaney, I think that is probably the best example of that idea. That there was more to the character, that looks aren't what define a man. It's the character itself, and even though the monster did evil, his intentions were good, and he did not mean to harm people. It was beyond his control. We're seeing sprinkled throughout here the scenes of the Universal's European Village set. And, just kind of looking at all these films, you see that it's very similar. We saw it in a little bit in Dracula, I believe, in the beginning with the Transylvanian Village, and we saw it definitely in our last film, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, with the Viserion set. And I really loved driving past it on the Universal tour, just seeing how this, the kind of this mecca for me, the place where all the magic was made. Right now we're about to see, I don't know, I've said that so many times that there's so many iconic moments in this film, but this probably takes the cake. We have little Marilyn Harris here as Maria, and she is pretty spectacular here, and she breaks your heart. She really, well, she doesn't break your heart, but the scene with her does here with the monster. And, children did identify with the monster. Karloff apparently got a lot of fan letters from kids because they saw, kind of the awkwardness in the monster, and that he didn't know his place in the world. And that's really kind of what being a child is about in some ways, learning your place in the world and not understanding it. I love... Apparently Marilyn Harris got along really well with Karloff. There's a great story where she just, like, Karloff was sure that she'd be so afraid of him and his monster makeup, but he wanted to drive to the lake with her. No, she wanted to drive to the lake with him, and he was just so touched by that. That smile on his face. It say what you will, I don't think anyone could have brought as much pathos to this role as Karloff. I like Lugosi probably a little bit more, but I will say that Dracula isn't as well made a film as Frankenstein. And I don't know about performances, but Karloff, he creates a very different character, and it's really about being human here. And here's this tragic moment here where Karloff's monster realizes that he's all out of flowers, and he murders the poor girl, and not intending to, of course. The restored version of the film doesn't really show. It shows the scene, but it looks kind of off because the scene, I guess, hadn't been seen in about 60-some years. It was taken out of the film. I think that above any other scene, even Henry screaming that he knew what it was like to be God, was the most controversial scene, and it should be. It should be controversial. It should be pushing the edge, but it shows the monster. It shows what the monster is. He didn't mean to hurt the girl. He just wanted a friend, and he didn't understand the extent of his own power. Frankenstein is a film of very powerful images, but I don't think there's a more powerful one than the father of Maria bringing his dead daughter through the streets. It's more horrifying than the monster or the digging up of the graves. Right now, Elizabeth is going to talk with Henry and realizes that she knows something about the monster and that she fears what is going to happen. And this brings up kind of one of the big continuity errors about the film. She talks about Dr. Waldman being away, and how do they know he's locked up in that tower? One thing I think Clive could have given more to his relationship with Elizabeth in this film and Bride of Frankenstein. He doesn't really empathize really well with the fear of Elizabeth's character. He merely, says, "Oh, it'll be okay, it'll be okay." But I think what would have been more interesting if the film had been braver either time would have been to give Henry that cathartic moment. Both times in this film and in the original script for Bride of Frankenstein, the movie intended to kill off Henry. But I think it's wise that they didn't kill off Henry, because Clive, I think, just really gives into that role and really makes you see what Henry is. That he doesn't intend to be evil. He's a lot like the monster. And that symmetry between the monster and Henry, the idea that God put a little bit of something of himself in Adam and Eve. I think the best versions of the Frankenstein story put something of themselves something of the Doctor in the monster. And I think there is some moments in Frankenstein where you see that the monster and Henry both overestimate the world, that they don't fully understand it, and that even though they do have good intentions and that they want to be by people and they want to be loved, they eventually end up hurting everyone they come into contact with. Going off of that idea, right now, there is a really clever idea with that National Theater production of Frankenstein with Benedict Cumberbatch that, as of this recording, 2014, is going on. The idea that the monster is played on one night by an actor, and then on the other night, the actor playing the Doctor plays the monster. I think that's just really a clever idea, and I think it really would strengthen the acting from those characters. And really, the monster becomes Henry's surrogate son, in a way. The film leads up to the monster and Henry confronting each other. And here's that image I was talking about. That's so horrific, and it's so powerful. But like I was saying, Frankenstein and his creation in the best versions of the story, and even in the initial novel, the whole accumulation of things leads up to the monster asking, "Why did you do this? Why, what am I?" In the Kenneth Branagh version of the story, I know a lot of people don't really like that version of the story all that much. They think it's a little excessive and maybe a little melodramatic, and to be fair, Branagh does deal in excess. But there's a great moment in the film which I think really sums up the Frankenstein myth, where De Niro's monster confronts Branagh's Frankenstein and asks him about the pieces of himself. Was a soul the only piece that he forgot to include? Right now, we're about to see the DNA of all monster films. The idea of the classic mob. And right now, the mob has something, but, later on they come with pre-lit torches. Here we have Colin Clive and Victor Moritz, or John Bowles. Victor Moritz, this is like the sum up of his character. He should have been out of it, but right now Henry just tells him to take care of Elizabeth. He should have been on the hunt. He should have been on the hunt too. Do you understand? In your care. Right now I'm going to have to switch the side of the disc, so we'll just take a brief second-long break. And we're back again. Right now, the mob is about to be formed, and they are about to hunt down a monster. I think what I really like, actually, about this ending scene is actually the sets, I think, and the sets of this scene, and kind of like the action of it. There's a lot of forward momentum and urgency that, if you want to compare it to Dracula, that just certainly isn't there in Dracula. One thing I really think is interesting, just as looking at this as a series, but just this and the original film, is how the monster, or how the community views Henry Frankenstein. As the series progresses, the whole town sort of villainizes him. But in this one, he's viewed as kind of a hero in some ways, in that he leads the fight against the monster, that he realizes that it's his creation and he is the one that has to put it down. But as the series progresses, of course, he becomes a villain. But I think this version's actually stronger. I think this is the way that this Frankenstein story should be told. That Henry, or Victor, as he's called pretty much every other time, realizes that he has to take responsibility for what he's done, and realize that his monster is a perversion of nature, and that it has to come to him taking away the artificial life that he's given him. I love the sets here, the mountainside. There's great lighting here in particular. I really like there's like this transparent backdrop cloth, which, it's one of those few instances that in these old Hollywood films where you can tell that something is artificial. Right here, this is what I'm talking about. This sky, and this sky cloth with the clouds in the background. You can tell it's a painted backdrop. But, just the idea of the idea of it, it's kind of like a play, like a really well-made set, It adds to it, and I like the theatricality of it. This is probably the most evident moment with the dogs running against it. It's really, really fantastic looking. Henry is separated here, and they don't really do a great job of separating him from his group. I think he just kind of takes a step away, and they all pretty much leave him be. The monster doesn't understand what is going on. And I love Karloff's reaction shots here of him flailing his hands and scowling as if to say, "Leave me alone. Just leave me be. I don't know why you're mad at me." Here's that scene I was talking about. It's one of the more humorous scenes of the movie where Clive just sort of steps away and doesn't even notice his mob going away from him. The tension here when Frankenstein comes face to face with his creation is just so thick you could cut it with a knife. You can tell Karloff doesn't have to say anything. And I can understand why, when Bride of Frankenstein came around, when Karloff didn't want to give the character dialogue, because, there's so much more here, I think. And we wanted to discuss which film I personally liked more, Frankenstein or Bride of Frankenstein. It's a really hard choice, but I have to say, I think it's this one. I think Clive is more intense here. Ooh, that's painful. Clive just falls on that fire. You think he burnt his leg or something. But here's Karloff going to bring him to the windmill. which is just the perfect way to end this film. There's a brilliant moment in the windmill scene where the monster and Frankenstein move about with the like the gear that powers the windmill, and you see them looking at one another like it's their reflections. One thing I really think is outstanding about this windmill set is that this is the best I think that Universal comes to mimicking the German expressionist films. The sets in Dracula I think are outstanding, but a little too polished. And this windmill looks like it comes out of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And, just like the angles and the shadows and just the idea that it's so jagged and artificial looking. And, just going off what I was saying earlier about that set there, I think that really kind of adds something there, too. The idea that there is some theatrical and dreamlike about this finale of this picture. The windmills kind of become a trope in recent films. I'm kind of pleasantly surprised by that. And Van Helsing, which is kind of a really, really goofy movie. But, the one moment it gets right is the beginning. Here's that moment I was talking about with them kind of playing with that gear there. But Van Helsing, which is a goofy movie, it begins with the windmill. And, Frankenweenie, the new Tim Burton film about the dog and being brought back to life, it ends in a windmill. I think it's like at a advertisement thing or a golf course, and the monster is in there, and the animated boy looks like the splitting image of Colin Clive. That's the fakest dummy ever. And just the idea of, seeing that dummy thrown onto the windmill piece, it's real goofy looking, and, the human body doesn't look like that. Here, Henry was supposed to die, and kind of oversexed with Bride of Frankenstein, that this is where the next film begins. You think he's being brought home to die. But I love Karloff here in that he's so utterly petrified. He's not like a traditional villain dying at all. He is so scared that he doesn't understand why this is being done to him. It's really a powerful and very intense scene, and those screams are of terror. It's not like Dracula, where he's malevolent and evil. He just doesn't understand, and he's so afraid of fire. It's really one of the best, just one of the best performances in film. You look at the horror actors, and just the idea of these macabre characters, and you don't think that it takes a good actor to play a macabre, villainous character, but Karloff, Lugosi, and even Chaney really lent their all to all these movies. Karloff, this whole windmill sequence that ends the film, it really ended up hurting him very badly. He had developed back and leg trouble from lifting Colin Clive up and down the film, but I think it's a worthy price because he is unforgettable, and that, just like the culmination of all the film and all this performance of the monster, just seeing him in that windmill really reminds us what an incredible actor Karloff was. This scene with Frederick Kerr, who once again comes back to us after sad scene or a scary scene to give us some laugh, he brings a happy ending, and that is not Colin Clive in that bed in the background. But, you know, I'm glad that Universal wasn't Whale decided that, you know, Henry should live through this, and that he should get some redemption.
As I said before, I say again.
Just to a son of House of Frankenstein. And that's the last time we'll see the old Baron, because by the time Bride of Frankenstein comes, he dies, even though that scene probably would have taken place during Bride of Frankenstein. And now it's the end. It's a Universal picture. And this film really, if Dracula really was just a taste, but this film really cemented the idea that monsters were something to be reckoned with, and that actors like Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi could bring these different characters to life and show that maybe monster was just a point of view, and shock the audience and challenge them, you know, with these new ideas that they were not accustomed to, or maybe that they were, and they wanted to shock themselves. They wanted to sin maybe a little bit and think about some blasphemous thrills. And Whale will deliver them, that's for sure, in the films following this, The Old Dark House and The Invisible Man. And that is the end of Frankenstein. It's really a challenging film, I think, to go into, because there's such intricacies to it, and there's great performances, and, you know, they're challenging performances in that you look at Henry Frankenstein and you don't see him as being very intricate. You see him as being very on the straight-edged path into madness, into craziness. And I don't think that Colin Clive brought that to the role. I think he brought the part of a dreamer to it. And that is really what I identify with his performance. He is great in the film. And of course, Karloff is really the king of monsters. And that's saying something, because the Frankenstein isn't about a monster. It's about a poor man who is brought to us through artificial means and wants nothing more than to not be seen as a monster. And I think that is why this film continues to have such resonance. And I think that's why Karloff continues to be thought of as a great actor. And that's the conclusion of the film today. I had some fun doing it, and I hope you enjoyed listening to it. It's a great movie, and I hope it serves as a good companion piece to my Dracula commentary. I don't know if I'm going to do monsters more. I mean, I would very much like to, but we'll try and give you something a little bit different next time. My name is Mike, and this was Frankenstein. Enjoy.